morning, BridgeWay. So good to be with you. Sorry I'm laughing. I put the table behind him and he ran into it. So it's the little things in the morning. Hey, so good to be with you guys. I'm Pastor Mike, and I get to share the word with you today. So excited for that. If you didn't know, we just finished up a sweet series called Transform. We were talking about the ways God transforms us and how we can push back against the culture and how it wants to conform us. If you missed that, please go back, jump into that series, check it out on our YouTube or on our website. We have all those resources there. We also have a guide that we put out with each of these messages that you can download, or you can just read right off our website to take these sermons a little bit deeper. So we're excited about those things. Today, though, we are jumping into a new series, like Justin said, and it's called The Biggest Turnoff to Christianity and the Church. Now, I know some of you were like, the biggest turnoff? And then I told you about the church, and you're like, oh man, I thought we were going to talk about dating tips. No dating tips this morning, sorry. We're gonna jump in though, because I think this is super applicable to what we're talking about and what our culture is facing today. So today, we did a little bit of research and we found the study, and there's a big list of like things that make people doubt, or that people are doubting or struggling through when they think about the church of Christianity. And number 2 on the list, I wonder if you guys can guess. Anybody got an idea? What was number 2 on the list? Any guesses out there? No guesses, no guesses, no guesses. All right, you can tell your neighbor. What do you think it is? Number 2 on the list. All right, we're being shy this morning. I see like 2 of you talking to your neighbor. The rest of you are like, I have no idea, Mike. That's fine, we'll get into it. Justin gets to share number 1. I don't know how we decided that, but maybe he is number 1, so we'll let him do that. Number 2 on the list, though, is suffering. So you came on Suffering Sunday, so welcome. We're going to jump right in. Actually, we are really going to jump right in. So we're going to jump into the book of Job, Job chapter 1. If you have read the Bible, or even if you haven't, this is a pretty popular story about suffering. So we're going to read it just so that it's in our minds so we can understand where Job is coming from. So Job chapter 1, we're going to read verse 13 through 19, then just a short chunk in chapter 2. Like I said, you probably have heard this before, but to give us the context to be able to talk about how we engage with suffering, and really how we engage with others who are struggling through suffering. So, verse 13 says, one day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who's escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans have formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who's escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the older brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. We're going to read those next couple of verses in just a second, but I don't know if you're reading this and you're like, this is kind of overwhelming. Like, you read the first one, you're like, okay, he lost a couple things, and you read the next one, you're like, what is happening here? Like, this is the worst game of dominoes ever. Like, this guy is just getting hit hard. But it doesn't stop with things that just happen outside of him. It actually affects him personally as well. And so we get into chapter 2, verse 7. It says, so Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. So now we have the picture that we're kind of taking a look at this morning. We've got all these things that are happening to Job, right? Like, he loses a bunch of animals, which in that time was his money, right? So if you read the context, you read the end of the book of Job 2, how they talk about wealthy people is the amount of animals, the amount of things that they had, and that was their currency. He was the richest, okay? He had a ton. So he loses all the animals and all of those servants except for the few that got away. And then he loses all of his kids in the same thing. And then shortly after that, because he still wasn't cursing God, he starts to himself suffer personally on his body. Like he gets sores so bad that I don't know about you guys, but when I read that verse in verse 9, it says, curse God and die. His wife says that to him. Like how bad must it have been that she said that to him, right? Holy cow. That is crazy. But this is what we're dealing with here, and there's an exchange that we'll get into a little bit between God and Satan that you're kind of seeing at the little chunk that we just read. But the biggest point that I want us to catch right now is the amount of suffering that Job is going through. Now, Job, later on in chapter 23, they all kind of have a response to this. His friends do. Job does. Obviously, his wife does right away. And they have different responses, and we're going to kind of talk about those responses and what they can help us with today. So we're talking not just about the beginning of Job, but we're going to talk about the whole book. So maybe at some point, go read it again, just to kind of get the whole context, but we're going to do a little bit of summary with it today. So in Job 23, you see his response, and it sends us into a question that I think a lot of people have. So in Job 23, 3-6, this is not on your screen, so I'm just going to read it to you. If only I knew where to find him. Job's talking about God. If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling, I would state my case before him. I would fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say to me. Would he vigorously oppose me? No, he would not press charges against me. Now, if you're listening to that, he's saying, I want to go and find God, because if I found God and I just told him like this stuff, like it just kind of seems like God would get it. He's saying, I don't understand this because I'm a good guy, I'm just, I've not done things, I am blameless before God. That's what the beginning of the book of Job says. That he is blameless before God. And so he's like, I don't get this. God just must not be paying attention right now. Like, I just got to go to him and make him understand. So really, his question is the question that we all have, or that many have had, is how can we have a good God and suffering people? How do we have a good God and suffering people at the same time? Right? It seems like if you have a good God and suffering, one of them can't be. They just don't seem to work together. And we know that there's human suffering, right? So that leads people to believe that there can't be a good God. And that's often where people stop, is right there. Well, those two don't seem congruent, I'm out. And so that can be the thing that leads them, that is the turnoff to Christianity, the church, and ultimately to God. But I propose that that's too simple. See, for God to stop the suffering, he would have to take away the choice. See, he gives us a choice to love. And if he takes away that choice, then what are we, right? If he takes away our choice to love him, what are we? We're walking around as robots, right? And I don't know about you, but the last time I needed a grease on this elbow was never. So I'm not a robot here. I have feelings. I make a choice. I choose to follow God, and I choose to love him. And the choice to love him is what makes it so powerful. See, Job makes an argument that God doesn't know what he's doing. And God responds. You can check this out at the end of the book of Job, basically saying he is God and he knows everything. Even though it doesn't make sense to you and I in the moment, that doesn't mean it doesn't to him. And he's given us this book to help us understand even a piece of that. See, he's shown us his goodness in here. He's shown us Jesus, right? Because he could have left us in the spot where we are, where we have to try and make up for all the things in our lives, the evil in our own lives, to try and make ourselves right before God, but he doesn't. He has sent his son to enter into this world, to pay the price for all of us so that we can have a chance to have a good relationship with him. And that chance part is our choice. Because we get to choose what to do with that, to step in and to choose to love him. See, he loved us, and he gave us a choice to love back. And what I love is we did a series a while back in Revelation, and we did a good picture. Ron did a great picture, even wrapping it up, where he talked about the foreshadowing that God will defeat evil and suffering. This is coming. It's all going to be made new, and evil and suffering will be gone. But it's going to happen in his time. So sometimes you just have to remember, in the middle of all this, that we're in a battlefield. We are in a battlefield between good and evil. At the beginning of this book, we didn't read it, but you see God and Satan, and they're talking to each other, and Satan is doing his best to just get his way and to tear things down and to be Satan. And there's a battle between good and evil that is raging, and you guys know it. So there may be people that are good and they get good things, and there may be people that are bad and they get bad things, but they also may not. We're on a battlefield because of the sin of our ancestors, because of our own sin, because of the devil's sin. And the result of that was consequences, right? Even the ground is cursed because of our sin. So when we see things like natural disasters, when we see things that don't seem to make sense, we have to remember that this is the middle of a battlefield. We're in the middle of a battlefield. And even the devil could be using this as a weapon against us and trying to get to God. Now, I don't claim that this is going to be a complete argument today. There might be some other thoughts that are running through your head right now, and some of you might even have some better arguments that you can use to talk through how do we deal with suffering. And I'd be happy, honestly, if you want to chat more, if you want to, and then you're like, I'm thinking through this, Mike. This is a difficult one, and it's a difficult question. I'd be happy to reach out to me, reach out to any of our pastors. We'd be happy to chat with you, to work with you about suffering and how we can think through it. But we just talked through a few things that help us to have some handholds. There's a choice, right? We have a choice to love. And God has given us that, and that choice is his love. And we're in the middle of a battlefield. We are in the middle of a battlefield right now that is raging between good and evil, and there are casualties that are not on either side. And God's answer, I think, is awesome. So in Job 38:4, he starts to talk to Job at the end of the book, and he says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know." And he just keeps going with these kinds of questions. Where were you when the earth's foundation was laid? Where were you when we were measuring it out? Who did the measuring? And it's bringing us back to this question of who has the understanding. Because I'll tell you this much, I wasn't there. I don't know how this world's made, and we've got our scientists doing the best they can, and science in and of itself just means man's understanding. And so we're doing our best to understand what's happening here, but we weren't there at the beginning. And we don't have the full answers, but we know somebody who does. And we can rest in God's answer because we know his love, and he's shown us his love, and he continues to show us his love. Now, some of you today have just talked through kind of the intellectual, the thinking part of suffering, but this might be like fuel to the fire for you. You're like, Mike, this is not the time for this for me. Like, I'm not ready for this yet. And that's because you might be in a spot where it's more like Job, where it is just overwhelming. What you're going through is overwhelming. And I'm not trying to take away or to belittle that at all. And I'm sorry for what you're going through. I really am. And we see Job's wife respond, and this is the response here, that she says, curse God and die, right? And I don't know, I wasn't there, but when I see that response, it seems like maybe she's overwhelmed, right? Maybe she's so overwhelmed and she's just like, oh, because she's going through it too. This didn't just happen to Job, right? Like, she's there all along this. She loses all this stuff. She loses all her kids. And she's feeling this. And this is a response. And I'm not justifying her response, saying that this is right. But I'm saying that she might be just overwhelmed. And so she's turned off. So she's turned off to God because it's so overwhelming. She's not ready to think through it. She's turned off and she's like, I just want it to be done. See, sometimes we can't get to the intellectual question because the toll of the suffering is so great. We feel the suffering, the pain, the hurt, and it's overwhelming. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I get into suffering, I sort of have this response. It's kind of like this character. Maybe you know of him. And he says something to the effect of, in this actual picture, he says, what does he say here? He says, it's not a good tale, but I'm sort of attached to it. Right? Like, this is the response that I have in the middle of my suffering. I'm a bit of an Eeyore. Like, I can get in that spot where I'm like, well, it might be a good day. And I just kind of get in those moments, right? Like, where it's just difficult to engage with the world. And I'm struggling. I am struggling. Thank you, Eeyore, for a little bit of relief for a moment here as we think about dealing through this tough emotions. But what's our response, right? So we've got an intellectual problem, we've got an emotional problem that we're trying to deal with, but our response then, what do we do with this? Like, how do we engage with people that are suffering and are trying to work away and this is a turnoff for them? How do we respond with them? What is our natural response? And our natural response, I believe, is to relieve the pain. We do this in a lot of ways, right? Like, the first way I think of is we just like throw on our kung fu pants and we go into fighting mode, right? Like, I don't know about you, but if there's a mosquito that comes into my house, I know what happens with mosquitoes. They come over, they land on my skin, and they bite me, and I don't like it. So what do? It becomes a war zone in my house, right? Like, we get the kids armed, they get the fly swatters, they get the paper, they get the towel, and they go bonkers. We're trying to kill the mosquito. I'm not saying it's a bad way. It's just, sometimes there's a little bit of, crossfire, and some of the kids miss, and I get a welt in the back, Like, you ever heard that? Or been a part of that before, maybe? The other way that we try to relieve the pain is by altering the truth. We try to make it easier for people by just like, well, okay, that truth seems kind of hard, so let me just change it a little bit so that it doesn't feel so bad. But I got to caution us with the altering of the truth because that's been done before. At the beginning, the serpent, also known as Satan, put that same question to Adam and Eve. Did God really say that you couldn't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And he throws another one, because if you do, you'll be like God. And he just twists it just a little bit, right? Because there is a piece of that. They did end up knowing the knowledge of good and evil, but it wasn't for their benefit. The other way we try to alter the pain is we try to numb it. And you can think of all the ways in your brain, you probably are going there now, all the ways that we've found to numb it, right? We can do alcohol or medicine or drugs or sex, or we can do money, or we can even just throw ourselves into the group of people, right? Like, my way, I used to carry around all these sports equipment, these Frisbees in my car. It used to be like I'd have a Frisbee in the back, a soccer ball in the back. I'd have my swim trunks in the back because I wanted to be ready to go at a moment's notice for the next fun thing. And I wanted it to be now so I didn't have to engage with some of the pains. The last way is kind of the way we see Job's friends respond. And I'm not going to jump into their response. Their responses are really long. So it's kind of chapters 4 through 20-something. But they end up blaming Job And that's the other way that we do it. We either blame the person or we blame others. We're like, wow, okay, you're in this pain, but it's really their fault. And we take the eye off when it might be that other person's fault, but it might actually be something that they're working through and that they have to engage with. So that's what we naturally do. We want to relieve the pain. But my question is for us, is that really what's best for us? Is that really what we want? We need, our life is just about pain relief? Is that what we're living for? And I'd say, no, I don't think so. I think, because I think about it in this way, like if I'm going to try and get bigger muscles, what do I need to do? Lift bigger weights, right? Like I'm not coming up here with a little cue ball in my hand and sitting up here going, yeah, I can do 3,672 reps of this cue ball and I still don't feel the burn, right? Like I gotta get, like I go over to Ron's office, I was looking in there and he had this kettlebell in there and I was like, this is too heavy. I don't know if I'm gonna, this is too heavy for this sermon, but maybe I should have brought it. Anyways, but if you wanna get stronger, you need a bigger weight. And so you need to do the thing that's gonna hurt. And I don't know if you've done this, if you've done some lifting in a while, or if you've ran in a while, or if you've been in a PE class in a while, but the last time you realized, maybe not the next morning, but 2 mornings afterwards, you're like, ooh, oh, okay. Oh, leg day is hurting a little more than, last time. I'm feeling that. But there's a piece of you that goes, if you can get to the spot, you're like, oh, wait. That means I'm gonna get stronger. And if you can get to that spot, it's good. But you know that if you're gonna be lifting weights, if you're trying to get stronger, it's got to be, or it can be through pain. Even if like we're trying to stop something else in our life, right? Like we're trying to stop the other ways of relieving the pain. We're trying to stop the pain meds, alcohol, porn, or whatever it is. If you try to stop it, it will hurt. It will. But I'm telling you right now, and Ron said this actually a couple weeks ago in the Transform series, to be transformed, to grow, can mean pain. It can. But to get bigger muscles, we're going to keep on lifting those bigger weights. So what do we do instead? And I think there's a few different things that we can do. The first one, I think, is to sit in the mud. To sit in the mud. See, in Job 2:13, his friends actually do something right. A lot of times they get a bad rap. They're like, the friends, they didn't know what they're talking about. They're just giving Job a hard time. But they actually do something really good. In Job 2:13, it says, then they sat on the ground. They sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. They're sitting down with Job for 7 days and 7 nights. When's the last time you sat down for 7 days and 7 nights on the ground? Yeah, me neither. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. They didn't say a word. Can you imagine that? A week next to somebody else and 3 other somebody else's, and they say nothing? That sounds like a challenge, right? Like, that would be difficult. But they do it. They step in and they do it because they see how great his suffering is, and they just want to be with. And they do. That is a perfect thing to do. To step in. Job in that moment is overwhelmed with emotion, and that is the way to step in. See, Jesus can do this too because Hebrews talks about this in Hebrews 4:14-16, because he has suffered in every way as we have. He suffered in every way as we have. You can think about his end, right? Like, Jesus is betrayed. His friends are like running away from him. The whole people are like, they're putting nameplates above his head, mocking him. The soldiers are mocking him. He gets physically beaten. He goes through a trial of just embarrassment. Like, all of this stuff is just happening. And Jesus has suffered all this. But you can look at other parts. That wasn't the only time Jesus suffers, right? There's a little verse, it's one of my favorite verses, it's 2 words. So if you're trying to memorize a verse, this is where to start, okay? It says, anybody know it? Jesus wept. Jesus wept. And this is when his friend, one of his close friends, Lazarus, dies. Now, if you're like me, you look at that and you're like, but Jesus, you can heal him. And I know the end of the story, you do. but you still weep. And that tells us something about our Jesus, that he's been in this and he knows it too. So in Romans 12:5, it tells us what we should be doing. It tells us the same thing. It says, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. And Paul, in this section, he's talking about loving others, loving in action, and this is the way to do it, to mourn with those who mourn. The other thing we can do is we can bring a gift in the middle of these times. So we can sit with the people, and then sometimes we just need a physical reminder of the goodness, right? Like, this is why we bring flowers. We bring flowers and we set them there because they're pretty. And they remind us things grow. And they remind us that there's good. Or if you're coming to visit me and I'm hurting, you can bring me Reese's. That's fine. I'll take a Reese's instead of the flowers. Because Reese's are so good, right? They're so good. And they remind me that there is good. There is some good things. So if I can't use I can't receive your words right now, I can receive your action because I want to. I want to be reminded that there is good. And the last one is healing truth. We need to step in with healing truth. Now, there's a way to bring in truth, right? There's a way to just drop it on people. Like, here you go, here's your truth. And I did this the other day. Very not happy about this, not proud of this, but I was talking to my son, and there was something that happened in our house, and I was telling him that he did it wrong. And I just was giving it to him. And I knew I had crossed the line when the tears started coming down his face. And it shook me. Because I stepped in with truth, but I didn't care. And my son demonstrated it back to me. And he turned it back around. And he just gave me a hug. And the worst part about it is he wasn't even trying to defend himself. He had a question for me about something else. But we can step in, right? Like we do this. We step in with hard truth. But don't forget to care. Let the truth be the truth, but don't forget to care in it. So when you step in, you're sitting in the mud, you're given the gift. Speak that truth with your arm around them. You don't need to beat them over the head with it. As I begin to wrap up, I'm going to have the worship team start coming out here. I've got one more thing for you. And I want to challenge us that in the middle of this, to help others is to suffer well. And I've run into a bunch of people actually, and I could just start spitting names out right now. These people they suffer so well that, like, it's the people that you go and you meet them and you're like, wow, you're struggling with this, that, or the other thing, and you're coming to, like, care for them, and you bring this thing and you're like, oh, you're feeling so bad, and they're like, hey, it's so good to see you, thanks for coming, and they're blessing your day. They're like, hey, look, I have some cookies, here you go, and you're like, I'm supposed to be bringing you things, and they're just bringing joy in the middle of it. I mean, it doesn't necessarily even mean that, right? Like, there's moments, Job did it. You can read all about how Job was suffering, and he was lamenting, and he wanted out of it. But he still knew the truth. He still knew that God is over and above it all, and that God still loves us, and that God has been with us, because he's been here on this earth with us, like us, going through it. And when we do these things, when we sit, when we give a gift, and when we suffer well, we can remind people, and it gives them a chance for healing. Healing in their relationship, healing from the suffering, and hopefully they can be healed and made right with God. We give the chance. And we trust the Spirit to do the work, because Job was reminded as well, and he owns up to his part where he questioned God a little bit. We trust the Spirit to do that work. Let me pray. Father God, you are a good God. And God, sometimes we admit it's difficult. It's difficult to remember these things. It's difficult to remember in the middle of our suffering goodness. And it's difficult to remember why this is happening, God. And we ask these questions. But God, you are a God that has been here, and you've been with us, and you love us all the same. And you are a God that has been in it. You sent your son to step into this world. He experienced extreme suffering so that we could have a high priest, one that has been through it. And we can talk to him. You are a God that loves us and loves us so much that you are willing to leave that choice out there, knowing that we were going to have to suffer, but still giving us the choice to choose to love you. God, I pray that you be over any that are still struggling, that are thinking through this problem, that are listening to me now or listening to me later. God, that you would enter in and that you would wrap your arms around us and that you would give us a Father God hug. Remind us of your truth.